Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today we're continuing the series, the Unported playlist, where I take a look at some of my favorite unported arcade games of all time, and obviously Cruis'n USA is not one of those, because it was definitely ported to the Nintendo 64. But every once in a while I like to break my own rules and talk about a game that got a home console port, and the reason I'm doing that today is Cruis'n USA is a very interesting story about the hardware it runs on, how it's not Nintendo 64, and how this game kind of revolutionized arcade racing for a moment in time. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But when Cruis'n USA came out in 1994, it absolutely blew pretty much everyone away on the arcade floors because this was 3D, very impressively done in 94. And this would end up getting ported to Nintendo 64 in 1996, and that port is still technically inferior to the arcade original on the V-Unit board 2 years later. The other thing was we really didn't get as many games like this back in the day as you would think. Cruis'n USA had a completely different vibe compared to what Sega, Namco, and Atari were doing, and that 100% worked. This is definitely not the best arcade racing game of all time. It's a ton of fun and huge on the nostalgia factor, but as far as the courses and the controls are concerned, it's definitely a B-tier effort. At least in my opinion. You can leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. But honestly, why I love this game so much, it was just such a moment in time in arcades. When Cruis'n USA came out, pretty much every arcade you possibly could walk into would have one of these cabinets on the arcade floor. And for 1994, the graphics on display here are quite good. You have polygons, the textures aren't filtered, but they're relatively not too pixelated. You had a really good frame rate, and for the most part, you had a very fun experience. Every once in a while, the game will definitely take advantage of these tunnels to show you a little bit of an extra course where all they really did was copy and paste, but otherwise, this was still so impressive for 94. We were still on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and maybe if you were lucky, a 3DO, but 3D like this only came in the arcades, and if you'd played a couple too many Namco or Sega arcade racing games, playing something like Cruis'n USA was just absolutely a ton of fun. And of course it was Midway, so you got a bikini girl in there somewhere, stuff that would be removed from the Nintendo 64 port. This game is going to have animals that run across the street that you can absolutely explode, women in bikinis, and even Bill Clinton on the roof of the White House. Those are all things that changed for the arcade release versus the home console release, and that was definitely a bummer. But as we jump into the Chicago stage here, I love when my home city shows up in video games, and even if this isn't a very accurate representation of what Chicago really is like outside of the hit and runs and the potholes, it's always fun to see the city in a video game. And that's not really surprising at all. Midway was based out of the Chicagoland area, so definitely something you're going to see here. And I would say as far as the absolutely chaotic highway driving on display, it is no different than trying to take a general road in Chicago any day of the week. Just not very good drivers here. And I love that you go underneath the skyline into Lower Wacker Drive, which is absolute chaos in real life. People drag race down there all night long, going 100-120 miles an hour around a corner. You really do have to see it to believe it. But as far as the course layout in Cruis'n USA is concerned, it's a ton of fun, and this game launched an entire franchise. You'd have Cruis'n World, you'd have Cruis'n Exotica, all on more powerful arcade hardware that would then get ported home to the Nintendo 64. But Nintendo really wanted you to think that this ran on Nintendo 64 or Ultra 64 hardware back in 1994, when the reality is the Midway V-Unit arcade board was custom bespoke hardware that really didn't have anything in common with Nintendo 64 whatsoever. And when people bought this game back in the day for their new consoles, expecting to get a one-to-one like experience with the arcade, they were met with graphics that were definitely downgraded, a lower frame rate, and a bunch of censorship and removed items from the arcade version that never came over because of Nintendo's family-friendly policy, which is definitely a bummer. Not to say that the port is not a good port in its own right, and honestly I just really wanted to talk about some Cruis'n USA today. But it's a Midway game, they always had great soundtracks, so as we get into the Los Angeles stage here, I'm going to give you 45 seconds to listen to the music, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the history of the game, the games that came after it, and if we will ever see another Cruis'n USA game again. But enjoy the soundtrack because it's quite good and unique, especially coming out of the V-Unit hardware. Awesome music, and the rest of the Cruis'n series is going to go on to have just as good of music, and for some strange reason the Los Angeles track has always slightly reminded me of the Crash Bandicoot soundtrack on PlayStation. Definitely not any shared composers there, just one of those things, the tones kind of make me think of those games. But one of the best parts about Cruis'n USA is just how normalized it is. When you get to Cruis'n World, it gets a little bit more over the top, and when you get to Cruis'n Exotica, the game kind of becomes a parody of itself. But in the beginning game here, Cruis'n USA, it is just a pure arcade racing game. And if you watch me on the channel, you know it is one of my favorite genres. This is just something that is so good with a wheel in hand, pedals under your feet, driving around and basically having the time of your life. And again, for 1994, these graphics look great back then, and I would say for the most part they definitely hold up. All the polygons are perspective correct, there's no warping on them whatsoever, and while the textures might not be the best thing in the world, and there's definitely some pop-up, when you saw this thing in 1994 in arcades, you really hadn't seen many bits of 3D hardware that were as accomplished as this. Sure, it really couldn't stand up to what Sega had, or with Namco in the System 22, but Midway proved that you could have an arcade board made in America with some really good 3D power behind it, and the best part is, it was married to an awesome arcade racing game. And as we run through the Grand Canyon here, I love the fact that they really went with that USA theme. And maybe you've never been to the Grand Canyon, I have a long time ago, but pretty much every single course in this game, if you're in any way, shape, or form from America, is going to seem slightly familiar, and that's the fun part about this. It's like you're literally racing down the highways through neighborhoods and through areas of the US that are pretty much iconic in every way, shape, or form. And as you get further into the game, the courses are going to get harder, the roads are going to get narrower, and you're going to have to drive almost perfectly to see the checkered flag, because the physics in this game are cruel if you're in an accident. If you stack up against other cars, if you end up doing what I did right here, you are going to drop 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places in a row with one mistake, and then you're going to have to go ahead and try to claw your way back to first. And I will say, if there's one thing about this game I don't love, it's the rubber banding AI. Once you get into first place, they're going to be on your ass the entire race. But if you're back in 7th or 8th, suddenly they're going to completely slow down, letting you get all the way back to first with really no effort whatsoever. And that was really a Midway arcade thing. They would put rubber banding and other difficulty ramping in their games that would suddenly make you feel like an absolute champion, and then make you feel like absolute garbage about 30 seconds later. NBA Jam probably being one of the most famous examples of that rubber banding and changing of difficulty depending on your performance. But if you get good at this game, if you learn the tracks and understand the turns and physics, you definitely can get some checkered flags. You'll see here I got 3rd and would have had 1st if I didn't crash into that bus, and that is totally my fault. But it seems like the traffic patterns in this game are semi-randomized depending on how fast you're going and where you are, so you're not going to see the same vehicles in the same spots the same 2 ways. And as you go through the redwoods here, this is maybe the hardest track in the game, and sometimes I feel like they made the difficulty on the tracks a little bit too high towards the end, because you need to be perfect on every single turn here. It is a narrow road, and going off the road and hitting a tree is going to be disastrous for your performance. But I'm going to give you one more soundtrack sample, because this is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. I'll be right back in 30 seconds with some more Cruis'n. I'm not sure what the soundtrack to the Redwoods Forest should be, but that definitely works for me, and I love the engine noises and the sound effects when you hit cars and the other voices calling out when you've hit a checkpoint. Cruis'n USA is just one of those Hall of Fame first ballot good games. Is it the best racing game ever made? No, there's definitely better from Sega and Namco and even Konami in my opinion. But Cruis'n USA is pure nostalgia. This was impressive as hell back in 1994, and it really showed where the genre was going, and I wish we would get another Cruis'n game soon. I know we have some recently-ish, maybe like the last 7 or 8 years, but this is a franchise I would love to see come back. Give me one more Cruis'n game, give me over-the-top arcade racing with some jumps and shortcuts, and I would be a very happy person. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think of Cruis'n USA and what your favorite Cruis'n game is. I would probably say for me it is the arcade original, just due to pure nostalgia. But short of that, we're done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.
Welcome to the Hall of Fame.